With all the components, except for the toggles in place, it's time we made a start on that last part of the soldering. But before you get stuck into just simply slotting the toggles in and soldering, I recommend putting the black acrylic sheet, that's the sort of switch mounting plate, in place, down here. And to do that correctly, you're going to need some of the other hardware that comes in the kit. You're going to need the 8 machine screws. You're going to need the M4 nylon nuts. And there are 2 sized spacers that come in the kit, the 6mm and the 9mm. And it's the 9mm spacers that go between the PCB and the black acrylic sheet. Now I'll just move the PCB out of the way so we can concentrate on setting up this hardware. Obviously, based on the symmetry of the switches, where we have 2 groups of 8 and then the smaller group of 6 switches, the bolts holes are closer together here on the right hand side, and that obviously has to apply to all of the parts that have the bolts put through them. So I guess in that respect, the PCB is really your template. So we'll get started by, although we're not layering up all of the acrylic at this stage, we're just temporarily fixing this piece to the PCB. So put the 8 machine screws straight through, or socket screws I should say, straight through this black sheet of acrylic. Now we need to flip this to start putting the spacers and then fitting the PCB and doing up the nuts. Now there's a couple of ways. You could definitely turn to your collection of pieces of tape and tape these bolt heads in place. And that's probably the most effective way. Strangely enough, I haven't been doing that until now. And I think I make note of this in the assembly guide. It's handy to keep one of these sheets of cardboard from the packing around. And what I've been doing is laying that over the bolt heads and then just using that to flip the whole assembly without the bolts falling out. As soon as I've turned this over, I've realized something that I make a note of in the assembly guide as well. But some of the acrylic sheets still have either a piece of brown paper, or in this case, a slightly misty plastic sheet on the back. This came on the acrylic from the manufacturer and is left there during cutting, and I've left it there just to protect the sheet in transportation. So before we forget, at a later stage in the process, I'm just going to remove that now. Of course, it would have been slightly easier if I'd done that before I put the bolts through, but it's still not too hard. Okay, so let's get those 9mm spacers and just drop one down over each of the bolts. Circuit board. And as these nuts are just going on temporarily, it won't matter which way up you put them. My strong advice is only do them up finger tight. The last thing you want to do is start stripping the threads out of these nuts. Sorry, this bit's going to be a bit tedious while I go around the board and do these all up. By all means, feel free to skip ahead. As nothing's going to fall apart, now that the nuts are in place, you can stand it up and probably a little more rapidly use some kind of driver on the hex heads of the bolts to do them up. Really wouldn't recommend using an electric driver. You run the risk of over tightening. Okay, having made that little sandwich, we can start to look at putting the toggles in. Now, there's a tool that you've used earlier with these vertical slots to get the spacing behind the LEDs. The horizontal slots are going to help you get the alignment on the individual toggles right. I'd also recommend making sure you've got plenty of solder to hand before you start this. It really does soak up a fair amount of solder, and it'd be quite frustrating if you ran out midway. And as I make note in the assembly guide, these oval through holes in the circuit board that take the solder lugs on the toggle switches are deliberately just finger tight. So don't worry about that. It's by design, and you should be able to just push each toggle down until you can tell that it's seated neatly. And it's a fairly fine fit in these cutouts to make sure that the switch is well aligned. Now, the configuration I like to go with is the one that I've seen the most of in photographs of real IMSEI 8080s, which is to go with 4 blue, 4 red, 4 blue, 4 red, blue, red, blue, red, blue, and the red power switch. There are other configurations. I've seen some people talking about wanting to do an octal color pattern. The numbers of switches work out right for that. I've seen photos of IMSEI 80s on display with the red sets of 4 red and 4 blue switched over. It's really just down to your personal choice. At this point, you can see how one of the first switch that's covering an IC, which is why we wanted to make sure the ICs were socketed and inserted before we proceeded with soldering up these toggle switches. So I wouldn't be in a rush to put them all in place at once. I'd just work with a set of 8. You can see the alignment's already pretty good with the press fit and the tight fit here between these metal backing plates and the black acrylic. But this piece is provided just to help get that final spacing and horizontal alignment right. You can hold that in place with either some tape, or I've done it with a couple of large elastic bands. Just drop them down between a couple of switches. What is getting stuck on? The bolts. Excellent. You want to make sure those elastic bands are well out of the way of where you're going to be soldering. You wouldn't want to melt through it. And before we get started with the soldering, just more visual inspection to make sure everything's okay. These elastic bands are putting a little bit of tension on the switches upwards, so I'm just going to adjust where the tension is. Better to spend a little extra time getting everything lined up before you commit to soldering. Okay. Happy with that. Soldering iron at the ready. Plenty of solder. Now, even though we're pretty confident about the positioning of everything and it looks good from the front, I would still urge a degree of caution on how you proceed. Don't just immediately solder everything in. I would begin with the middle row of pins on the switches. Careful not to burn through that elastic band. Like I say, these are going to soak up quite a bit of solder. And with just that middle row of solder lugs soldered down, we can just go and check. Looking through here to make sure the bodies of the switches are all roughly at the same height. Looks to me like this third one might be sitting a little higher than the others. So I'm just going to apply some heat and some pressure with my fingers. Yeah, it just sat down then. And when I'm completely happy, having looked at it from every angle, I'm ready to solder the rest of it together. Go back and use plenty of solder on these. Remember, these pins are going to take all the mechanical strain when the toggles are operated. There isn't a mounting bracket as there was in the original IMSE 8080. Looking good.